Well, most people think fame is something that happens to you. You're in the right place at the right time, someone powerful notices you, and suddenly your whole life changes. That's the story Hollywood wants you to believe. But the truth? For some of the biggest names on the planet, nobody came to save them. Nobody handed them a record deal, a movie role, or a business opportunity. They clawed their way up from poverty, rejection, and circumstances that would have broken most people completely. We're talking about celebrities who started with nothing, and we mean genuinely nothing. Evictions, homelessness, abuse, addiction, doors slammed in their faces so many times they lost count. And yet somehow, through sheer will, strategy, and an almost terrifying refusal to quit, they built empires that the world couldn't ignore. What you're about to hear isn't the polished, publicist-approved version of these stories. It's the parts that got left out of the interviews, the early years nobody talks about, and the moments where everything almost fell apart permanently. Some of these names will surprise you. Some of the details will genuinely shock you. And by the end of this list, you might find yourself looking at fame and success in a way you never have before. This is the real story of the top 10 self-made celebrities of all time. And we're starting at number 10, hash 10. Cardi B before the chart-topping hits, before the fashion covers, before the courtroom drama, and the viral moments, there was a girl from the South Bronx who could barely keep the lights on. Cardi B, born Belcalis Marlenis Almanzar, grew up in one of the toughest neighborhoods in New York City, raised by a Trinidadian father and a Dominican mother who worked constantly just to keep the family afloat. Money was always tight. Stability was always uncertain. And the future didn't exactly look bright. She worked as a cashier at a grocery store as a teenager, doing what she could to contribute. But when she found herself in a dangerous, abusive relationship with nowhere to go and no financial cushion to fall back on, she made a decision that she's never shied away from talking about. She started working as a dancer at a strip club. Prend, a dancer at a strip club. And she's been remarkably straightforward about why. It was a way out. It gave her financial independence, it got her away from the situation she was in, and it gave her a platform she didn't expect. Because while she was working, she started building a social media presence. And not in a calculated marketing strategy kind of way. She was just herself. Loud, funny, brutally honest, and completely unfiltered in a way that felt genuinely rare on the internet. Her Instagram following exploded. She got cast on the VH1 reality series Love and Hip Hop, which expanded her reach even further. And through all of it, she kept working on music, not because a label told her to, not because a manager mapped it out for her, but because she wanted to. When Bodak Yellow dropped in 2017, it didn't just chart. It went straight to number 1 on the Billboard Hot 100, making Cardi B the first solo female rapper to achieve that since Lauryn Hill nearly 2 decades earlier. The industry sat up and paid attention. But here's what's interesting. By the time that record broke, Cardi had already built her audience herself. The label didn't create the fan base. She did, one raw, unscripted Instagram video at a time. Since then, the empire has only grown. A Grammy, multiple platinum records, a fashion collaboration with Fashion Nova that reportedly generated over $1 million in sales within 24 hours of launching. A partnership with Whip Shots, the first celebrity-branded vodka-infused whipped cream product. And through feuds, legal battles, public breakups, and the kind of tabloid scrutiny that would send most people into hiding, she has remained completely and utterly herself. That's the thing about Cardi B that people miss when they try to analyze her success. The industry didn't shape her into something sellable. She arrived already shaped, and every attempt to make her more polished or more acceptable got pushed back against, publicly and loudly. Her authenticity wasn't a PR strategy. It was, and is, the entire brand. But if Cardi B's story is about building a platform from scratch, the next person on this list is someone who had a platform handed to her and chose to build her own anyway. Hash 9. Kylie Jenner. Here's where things get complicated, because Kylie Jenner is a name that splits opinion almost perfectly down the middle. Half the internet thinks she belongs on a list like this. The other half thinks the very idea is ridiculous. And honestly, both sides have a point worth hearing. Let's be clear about what she had going in. famous family, massive built-in audience, and resources most aspiring entrepreneurs could never dream of. When Forbes named her the youngest self-made billionaire in history at age 21, the backlash was immediate and fierce. Critics argued, not unreasonably, that a woman who grew up on a reality TV show watched by tens of millions of people cannot meaningfully be described as self-made. The word, they said, was being stretched beyond recognition. But here's the other side of that argument. In 2015, Kylie Jenner took $250,000 of her own money she had earned through modeling and endorsements, not handed down by her family, and launched Kylie Cosmetics. No investors, no business partner with industry experience, no safety net beyond her own following. She started with a single product, a lip kit consisting of a liquid lipstick and a matching lip liner. It sold out in under a minute. Within 2 years, Kylie Cosmetics was valued at over $800 million. By 2019, she had sold a 51% stake to Coty Inc. for $600 million. The business model she pioneered, influencer builds audience, influencer becomes the brand, influencer launches product directly to that audience, is now the template for an entire generation of entrepreneurs. Before Kylie Jenner, that wasn't a proven formula. She helped prove it. Is it self-made in the traditional sense? Probably not entirely. But what she did with the platform she had was genuinely extraordinary, and dismissing it completely ignores the business acumen required to turn social media attention into a billion-dollar operation. Plenty of celebrities have large followings. Very few of them built what she built. The more recent story is also worth noting because the fairy tale has had some complications. Since the Coty acquisition, reports have suggested that Kylie Cosmetics has struggled, sales figures declining, the brand losing some of its cultural relevance as the influencer-to-product space became saturated with competitors inspired by her own model. Rumors circulated about tension behind the scenes, about the original valuation being questioned, about whether the business is as healthy as it appeared on paper. None of that erases what was built. But it does add a layer of complexity to the story. And it raises an interesting question about whether the same personality that built the brand is the right one to sustain it long term. That's a question plenty of self-made entrepreneurs face, and it doesn't have an easy answer. And if you think navigating a complicated public image is difficult, wait until you hear about a man who was rejected by every single person in his industry before he became one of the most celebrated artists on the planet. Hash 8. Eminem. There is a version of the Eminem story that starts with Dr. Dre hearing a demo tape and everything falling into place. That version is technically accurate and almost entirely misleading, because the real story starts nearly a decade earlier in the kind of circumstances that most people don't survive with their ambition intact. Marshall Mathers grew up in Detroit, not the comfortable parts. His mother, Debbie, has been described by people close to the family as deeply unstable, and the home environment Marshall grew up in was chaotic in ways that left permanent marks. He was bullied severely at school, dropped out before finishing 9th grade, and spent his teenage years working minimum wage jobs while trying to figure out how to make rap music in a city that hadn't yet become the cultural force it would later be associated with. He started going to open mic nights, battling other rappers in competitions that paid nothing but offered something more important: respect, if you could earn it, and he was earning it. But every time he tried to translate that underground credibility into something real, a record deal, a label's attention, any kind of industry foothold, he ran into a wall. Not one wall. The same wall over and over again. The reason, according to people who were there, was simple and brutal. He was white. Hip-hop was a black art form built by black artists, and a white kid from Detroit trying to be taken seriously in that space faced skepticism at every turn. Some of it was prejudice. Some of it was legitimate cultural critique. All of it was a barrier he had to figure out how to get over. He released an independent album in 1996 that essentially went nowhere. He kept battling, kept writing, kept building a reputation that the industry refused to acknowledge. And then, in 1997, a demo tape of his made its way to the Rap Olympics in Los Angeles, where it got into the hands of someone who worked with Dr. Dre. The rest of the story is well documented. What's less documented is that by the time Dre heard that tape, Eminem had already spent the better part of a decade earning it. The Slim Shady LP dropped in 1999 and changed everything. Not just for Eminem, for hip-hop broadly. The cultural conversation around the genre shifted. Censorship debates exploded. Critics argued about authenticity and appropriation. And through all of it, Eminem just kept making music that people couldn't stop listening to, whether they wanted to admit it or not. The darker chapters are part of the story too. His marriage to Kim Scott was famously volatile and documented in some of the most disturbing lyrics ever committed to a major label album. His relationship with prescription medication spiraled in the mid-2000s into something genuinely life-threatening. He later revealed he had come close to not surviving it, describing a period of dependency that took years of recovery to climb out of. When Relapse came out in 2009, it was the creative evidence of someone who had been through something serious and come back from it. He is now, by any measure, one of the best-selling music artists in history. Multiple Diamond-certified albums. A film, 8 Mile, that turned his own story into a cultural moment. A label, Shady Records, that has launched other careers. And he built it all starting from a position where the entire industry had told him, clearly and repeatedly, that there was no place for him. Some people hear that story and call it inspiring. Others call it something more complicated. A question about who gets to occupy certain spaces and what it costs. Either way, the grind was real, and nobody gave him anything. But if Eminem's story is about being told you don't belong, the next person on this list was told something even more fundamental, that she herself was not enough. #7, Oprah Winfrey. If you were designing the circumstances least likely to produce one of the most powerful media figures in human history, you might come up with something that looks a lot like Oprah Winfrey's early life. Born in rural Kosciuszko, Mississippi, in 1954, to a teenage mother who was barely equipped to care for herself, let alone a child. Raised in poverty so real and so concrete that she famously wore potato sacks for clothing as a little girl because that was what was available. The abuse she experienced as a child, which she later discussed publicly in interviews that shocked audiences around the world, was severe and lasting. She has spoken about sexual abuse at the hands of family members, about chaos and instability that no child should have to navigate. She ran away at 13. She was sent to live with her father, Vernon Winfrey, in Nashville, and by most accounts that change in environment was the first stable thing she had ever experienced. She discovered early that she was extraordinary with words. She won a speech competition that earned her a full scholarship to Tennessee State University. At 17, she was hired by a local radio station. At 19, she became the youngest person and the first Black woman to anchor the news at Nashville's WTVF-TV. The trajectory seemed clear, and then it got complicated. Her first major television job in Baltimore ended badly. Her news director reportedly told her she was too emotionally invested in the story she was covering, that she cared too much, cried too easily, and lacked the professional distance required of a serious journalist. By most conventional measures, that was a criticism. By the standards of what came later, it was the most accidental and backhanded piece of career advice in television history. Because what was too emotional for hard news turned out to be precisely what made her the most compelling talk show host the format had ever seen. When she took over a failing morning talk show in Chicago in 1986, a show called AM Chicago, it went from last place to first in the ratings within a month. It was renamed The Oprah Winfrey Show, went national, and became a cultural institution that ran for 25 years. The business decisions she made along the way were as impressive as anything that happened on screen. She negotiated ownership of her show, something almost unheard of at the time, especially for a Black woman in 1980s television. She launched Harpo Productions, which gave her control over her content and her image in a way that most television personalities never achieve. She launched O, the Oprah magazine, became a book world kingmaker through her book club, and co-created the Oxygen Network before eventually launching OWN. The Oprah Winfrey Network, OWN, had a rocky start. The early years were difficult enough that the press began writing premature obituaries for the brand, questioning whether the Oprah magic could translate to a full cable network she was running rather than simply appearing on. The struggles were public and uncomfortable. But she restructured, brought in new programming, and slowly rebuilt. By the mid-2010s, OWN had found its audience and its footing. She became the first black female billionaire in history. She did it in an industry that had told her, in no uncertain terms, that her natural qualities were liabilities. And every single one of those so-called liabilities turned out to be exactly what built the empire. The lesson her story carries is unsettling in the best way. Sometimes the thing they're trying to change about you is the thing you should never let go of. But if Oprah's story is about refusing to be reshaped by an industry, the next person on this list went one step further and built a completely new industry because the existing one wouldn't let him in. Hash 6. Jay-Z Sean Corey Carter grew up in the Marcy Houses, a public housing project in Brooklyn, New York. It's the kind of place where opportunity is scarce and the alternative economy fills the gap. By his early teens, Jay-Z was selling drugs on the street. Not as a lifestyle choice, but as a survival mechanism in an environment where the legitimate options were extremely limited. He's talked about this openly in interviews and encoded it throughout his music, refusing to either glorify it or sanitize it, which is part of what makes his storytelling so compelling. He was rapping during those same years, developing a style that was methodical, intricate, and almost literary in its construction. He had a gift that anyone with ears could recognize. What he didn't have was anyone in the music industry willing to give him a legitimate shot. Label after label passed. The rejections piled up, and at some point, Jay-Z and his partners, Damon Dash and Kareem Biggs Burke, made a decision that would change everything. If no label would sign them, they'd start their own. Rockefeller Records was founded in 1995, and they pressed and distributed Jay-Z's debut album, Reasonable Doubt, independently in 1996. It was critically acclaimed and built a devoted following. It didn't make him a superstar overnight. That came later, within my lifetime, Vol. 1 and the commercial breakthrough that followed, but the foundation was his because he had built it. The music career that developed from there is one of the most decorated in hip-hop history. 14 #1 albums. Collaborations with virtually every significant artist of the last 3 decades. A creative output that has been consistently praised and endlessly debated and never ignored. But the music is almost the smallest part of the Jay-Z story when you look at the full picture. He co-founded the sports and entertainment agency Roc Nation, which represents some of the biggest athletes and artists in the world. He acquired a stake in the champagne brand Armand de Brignac, known as Ace of Spades, and eventually sold it to LVMH in a deal that valued the brand at hundreds of millions of dollars. He launched D'Ussé Cognac. He invested early in Uber, a decision that alone reportedly returned extraordinary multiples. He built a streaming platform, Tidal, that was the subject of both excitement and controversy, with reports surfacing about inflated streaming numbers and disagreements with artists who had equity stakes in the company. The controversies around his NFL deal were particularly polarizing. When he partnered with the League on entertainment and social justice initiatives, significant voices in the Black community argued it was a betrayal of Colin Kaepernick and the movement that had formed around his protest. Jay-Z pushed back, arguing that having a seat at the table was more effective than standing outside it. That debate hasn't been fully resolved, and it reflects something real about the tensions between commerce and conscience that come with operating at his level. His personal life, too, has been subject to more scrutiny than most. His album 444, released in 2017, was a remarkable piece of public self-examination, in which he addressed infidelity in his marriage to Beyoncé with a directness that almost nobody in his position would have chosen. The album was widely praised precisely because it was uncomfortable, because it didn't ask for sympathy, and because it acknowledged damage in a way that felt genuinely rare from a man of his stature. He is now worth an estimated $2.5 billion, not from rapping, from building. And speaking of building something from nothing in a country that wasn't built for you, the next person on this list didn't just build a career, she accidentally rebuilt an entire industry. #5, Rihanna Fenty grew up in Bridgetown, Barbados, in a household that was fractured in ways she has spent years finding words for. Her father, Ronald Fenty, struggled with addiction to crack cocaine and alcohol throughout her childhood. The domestic environment she grew up in involved violence and instability that left real and documented effects on her. She has spoken about developing stress-induced headaches as a young child that were so severe, they required medical testing before doctors concluded the cause was emotional, not physical. She was 16 when a chance introduction led to an audition with music producer Evan Rogers, who was visiting Barbados on vacation. Rogers was impressed enough to fly her to New York to record demos. She had never left Barbados. She had no connections, no money, no safety net. She went anyway. Def Jam Recordings signed her at 16 after an audition with then-label president Jay-Z that reportedly lasted only a few minutes before he was convinced. Her debut single, Pon de Replay, announced an arrival. But the early years of her career were defined by something she's talked about candidly, a label that wanted to mold her, to make decisions about who she should be and how she should sound. Navigating that required a kind of strategic stubbornness that didn't always make her popular behind closed doors. The persona, Elle Nightmare, that became public in 2009, when images of her injuries following an assault by then-boyfriend Chris Brown were leaked before the Grammy Awards, was handled by her on her own terms, in her own time, and with a complexity that the media consistently tried to flatten into a simpler narrative. The years that followed were some of her most creatively rich. As though what she had survived became material, she turned directly into art. But the real seismic shift came in 2017, when she launched Fenty Beauty. The beauty industry had been selling foundation in a limited range of shades for decades, routinely leaving darker skin tones without adequate options and treating that gap as an acceptable business reality. Rihanna launched with 40 shades. 40. The internet response was immediate, overwhelming, and deeply emotional from consumers who had never seen themselves represented in a major beauty launch before. Fenty Beauty made $100 million in its first 40 days. Within a year, it was valued at over $1.4 billion, making it the fastest beauty brand in history to reach that valuation. And perhaps more significantly, it forced every other major beauty company to overhaul their shade ranges almost immediately. The industry standard shifted because she changed it. Then came Savage X Fenty, a lingerie brand built on size inclusivity and diversity at a time when the dominant brand in the space, Victoria's Secret, was visibly struggling with its failure to reflect modern consumers. The Savage X Fenty runway shows became cultural events, watched globally, and praised for their casting in ways that the traditional fashion world had never managed. She is now, by most estimates, wealthier from her business ventures than from 20-plus years of music. The music was the foundation. The empire is everything that came after. And if Rihanna's story is about turning hardship into fuel, the next person on this list knows something about that too, starting from a moment where he had exactly $7 to his name. Hash 4, Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson. The story Dwayne Johnson tells about the lowest point in his life is remarkably specific, and the specificity is what makes it land. He was 23 years old. He had just been cut from the Canadian Football League, ending a dream he had spent years working toward. He came home to his parents' house in Florida. He reached into his pocket and found $7. That was it. That was everything. The number matters because years earlier, when he was a teenager, his family had been evicted from their apartment in Hawaii. He has described coming home from school to find all their belongings on the lawn, the locks changed, nowhere to go. Before that, there had been other evictions, other moves, a childhood defined by instability that came from real financial scarcity, not the made-for-television kind, but the kind where meals aren't guaranteed and stability is a concept other families seem to have access to. What happened after the $7 moment is a story of reinvention so complete that it's hard to fully comprehend unless you sit with both ends of it. He turned to professional wrestling, a career that required him to essentially create a character, a persona, an entire alternate identity. And he did it with such commitment and charisma that The Rock became one of the most beloved figures in WWE history, drawing crowds and generating merchandise revenue at levels the organization hadn't seen. But WWE, for all its spectacle, was a stepping stone he was already thinking beyond. Hollywood was supposed to be the hard part. The industry wisdom at the time was clear. Wrestlers don't become movie stars. The transition had been attempted before and hadn't worked. He was told his name was a problem, that his background was a problem, that the physicality that had made him famous in the ring was somehow too extreme for film. Every single one of those objections turned out to be wrong. The Scorpion King in 2002 led to a string of action films that built his audience steadily. Fast Five in 2011 was the breakthrough moment. He joined a franchise that was struggling, and it became the highest-grossing film in the series to that point. He became, for multiple years running, the highest-paid actor in Hollywood. Not despite his wrestling background, partly because of it, because he had spent years learning how to read a crowd and give them exactly what they wanted. The business empire he has built alongside the acting career is substantial and strategically diverse. $7 Productions, named directly and deliberately after that $7 moment, produces his films and television projects. Teremana Tequila, which he launched in 2020, reportedly sold over 1 million cases in its first year, making it one of the fastest-growing spirits brands in history. ZOA Energy entered a crowded market and carved out a significant position on the back of his brand alone. What makes the Dwayne Johnson story interesting beyond the money is the consistency of the work ethic that underpins it. There are real stories, told by directors and co-stars and crew members, about the discipline with which he approaches every project, the early call times, the preparation, the refusal to coast on the star power that would easily allow for coasting. Whether that's image management or genuine character is something only the people around him really know, but the output is undeniable. And while The Rock story is about rebuilding after the bottom fell out, the next person on this list knows what it's like to hit the bottom so hard that he lived inside it, literally, for years. #3. Tyler Perry at some point in the early 1990s, Emmett Perry Jr., who would eventually rename himself Tyler, was sleeping in his car in Atlanta, not for a night, not for a week, for stretches of time long enough to make the car feel like home. He was broke, he was largely unknown, and he was trying to make a stage play work in a city that had no particular reason to pay attention to him. He had grown up in New Orleans in a household with a physically abusive father, and the trauma of that childhood followed him into adulthood in ways that he has explored publicly and in his work. Moving to Atlanta felt like a fresh start. It didn't immediately become one. The first production of I Know I've Been Changed, a semi-autobiographical stage play he had written and produced himself, was an almost complete failure. He had poured every dollar he had saved into it. The audience barely showed up. The savings were gone. Most people would stop there. Tyler Perry staged the play again. And again. 6 years. Different cities, different venues, the same grind of building word of mouth in black churches and community centers, reaching an audience that mainstream entertainment had long ignored. And slowly, almost invisibly to anyone not paying attention, something started to build. By 1998, the play was drawing thousands of people. The Madea character, a large, loud, no-nonsense grandmother played by Perry himself in drag, had become a phenomenon in the Atlanta black community in particular. Other playwrights noticed, theater owners noticed, and eventually the film industry noticed, though not before continuing to ignore him for several more years. His first film, Diary of a Mad Black Woman, was released in 2005 by Lionsgate after larger studios had passed. It opened at #1 at the box office against studio productions backed by tens of millions of dollars in marketing. The industry was stunned. The audience he had spent years building, black women specifically, who had been systematically underserved by Hollywood for generations, showed up in overwhelming numbers. What followed was a filmography that critics frequently dismissed and audiences consistently embraced, a tension that Perry seems to have made peace with. The Madea franchise alone has generated hundreds of millions of dollars at the box office. The Tyler Perry's House of Pain television series broke cable records. And through all of it, he retained creative control in ways that Hollywood rarely grants to anyone, let alone an independent filmmaker who came from nowhere. In 2019, he opened Tyler Perry Studios on a 330-acre lot in Atlanta, a former Confederate Army base that he owns outright. It is the first major film and television studio in the United States owned by a black person. He is worth an estimated $1 billion. He did not inherit it. He did not receive it. He built it play by play, year by year, sometimes from the inside of a car. The controversies around his work are real and worth acknowledging. Critics, including some prominent black scholars and filmmakers, have argued that his portrayals of black women can be reductive, that the Madea character trades in stereotypes, that ultimately do harm even while entertaining. Perry has addressed these critiques directly and without apparent bitterness, arguing that his work reflects communities he knows from the inside and that those communities have the right to see themselves on screen, however imperfectly. Where that argument lands is something viewers can decide for themselves. What can't really be argued is the scale of what he built from an Atlanta parking lot. And speaking of building something from nothing, the next name on this list turned free mixtapes and sheer force of personality into one of the most decorated careers in the history of her genre. Hash 2. Nicki Minaj Annika Tanya Mirage was born in Trinidad and Tobago and moved to Queens, New York, at the age of 5 to join a father she barely knew. What she found when she arrived was complicated. Her father struggled severely with substance dependency and was at times violent, a presence in the household that was destructive in ways the family had to work around and survive. The Queens neighborhood she grew up in was tough in all the ways that phrase is usually meant, but it was also musically rich, saturated with hip-hop energy that was impossible not to absorb. She waited tables at Red Lobster in her late teens and was, by multiple accounts, fired more than once effing pon. Various jobs for what was diplomatically described as difficulty with authority. She was studying acting at LaGuardia High School, the same school that produced Jennifer Aniston and Al Pacino, and had genuine theatrical ability. But music was where her ambition was pointed, and she pursued it with a focus that didn't leave room for much else. The approach she took to building her career was unconventional and, in retrospect, visionary. She released a series of mixtapes, freely available, no cost to the listener, that showcased a technical ability that genuinely set her apart. Her flow was fast, multisyllabic, technically demanding, and delivered with a theatrical range that could shift from menacing to playful to devastatingly precise within a single verse. The mixtapes spread through the community like word of mouth, always does when the thing being talked about is genuinely extraordinary. Lil Wayne caught wind of her work and brought her into his Young Money collective, a cosign that opened mainstream doors without having been the thing that built the foundation. She already had a reputation before Wayne amplified it. What the Young Money platform gave her was reach, and she used it to release Pink Friday in 2010, a debut album that entered the Billboard 200 at #1 and eventually went quadruple platinum. The career that followed is one of record-breaking consistency. She became the first female solo artist to have 7 singles simultaneously charting on the Billboard Hot 100. She collected Grammy nominations in both rap and pop categories, a crossover achievement that reflected the genuine breadth of her appeal. She appeared on more charting hip-hop singles than any other artist in history, male or female, at one point. The public narrative around her career has been shaped significantly by her conflicts, with Remy Ma, with Cardi B, with critics who questioned her authenticity or her longevity. The beef with Remy Ma produced Ether, a diss track that many in the hip-hop community pointed to as a decisive blow. The tension with Cardi B erupted publicly and visibly enough that it became one of the most covered feuds in recent music history. Nicki's perspective, that she had come up in a time when there was only supposed to be one woman at the top of the genre, and that she had fought against that framing, adds context to the conflicts even when the conflicts themselves generated more heat than light. Her marriage to Kenneth Petty has been the subject of significant controversy. Petty has a criminal record that includes a conviction for manslaughter and a sex offense that required him to register as a sex offender, and when Nicki married him, the pushback was intense and public. She has not publicly stepped away from the relationship and has addressed criticism of it directly, though not always in ways that satisfied her critics. Through all of it, the feuds, the controversies, the temporary retirement announcement she made in 2019 before reversing course, she has continued to make music that commands attention and move cultural conversations in ways that only artists with genuine impact can do. She is one of the best-selling female music artists in history. She built that from mixtapes that she gave away for free, in a genre that told women they could only occupy a very limited space. She took more space anyway. But if Nicki Minaj's story is about arriving with talent and refusing to be contained, the final name on this list arrived with almost nothing. Not the money, not the language, not even the cultural familiarity with the country he was trying to conquer, and somehow ended up running it. Hash 1. Arnold Schwarzenegger. There is a village in Austria called Thal. It sits just outside the city of Graz, small and quiet in the way that villages in the Austrian countryside tend to be. Arnold Alois Schwarzenegger was born there in 1947. His father, Gustav, was the local police chief and a strict, demanding presence in the household. A man who reportedly made no secret of his preference for Arnold's older brother Meinhard, who he considered the more promising of the two sons. Arnold has described his childhood as cold in ways that weren't just about the Austrian winters. His father saw little promise in the boy who spent his afternoons looking at pictures of American bodybuilders and dreaming about a country he had never seen. He started lifting weights at 14. By 15, he had a clarity of purpose that most adults never find. He was going to be the greatest bodybuilder in the world, and then he was going to go to America, and then he was going to become a star. The specificity of this vision, articulated at that age with that conviction, is either the story of extraordinary self-knowledge or extraordinary self-deception. In Arnold's case, it turned out to be the former. He won the Junior Mr. Europe contest at 17. He won Mr. Universe at 20, becoming the youngest person ever to do so at the time. He went on to win Mr. Olympia 7 times. 7. In the history of professional bodybuilding, that number is essentially synonymous with one name. The discipline required to achieve it, the training regimen, the diet, the psychological commitment to a physical ideal that most human bodies simply aren't built to approach, is almost impossible to fully convey in language. People who knew him during those years describe a focus that bordered on frightening. He arrived in America in the late 1960s with limited English, barely any money, and a name that the American entertainment industry would spend years telling him was an insurmountable problem. The notes from early Hollywood meetings reportedly included observations that his accent was too heavy, his name was unpronounceable, and his body was frankly too large and too muscular to work on screen. Too extreme, too specific, too much. These were the obstacles as the industry saw them. He saw them differently. He hired a dialect coach. He took acting classes. He took business classes, invested his bodybuilding earnings in real estate, and built a financial foundation that gave him the leverage to wait out the industry's hesitation rather than compromise on his terms. He was patient in a way that is genuinely unusual for someone with his level of ambition. He understood that the architecture of a career needed to be built before anyone would accept the person building it. Conan the Barbarian in 1982 gave him a platform. The Terminator in 1984 turned him into something else entirely. A cultural phenomenon, a character so perfectly suited to his particular combination of physical presence and deadpan delivery that it felt almost designed. Predator! Total Recall. Terminator 2. He became the highest paid actor in Hollywood, commanding fees that had never been paid to a single performer before. He did this with an accent that Hollywood had told him was a liability, a name that Hollywood had told him was unpronounceable, and a body that Hollywood had told him was too much. Then he ran for governor of California. He had no political background, no party infrastructure, no campaign experience. He announced his candidacy on The Tonight Show with Jay Leno in 2003 during the recall election that removed Gray Davis from office. He won, and then he won again in 2006 on a platform that included significant climate policy, an unusual position for a Republican governor that drew criticism from both sides and ended up being one of his more lasting policy legacies. The personal scandal that emerged in 2011, when it was revealed that he had fathered a child with a member of his household staff, a secret kept for over a decade while he was married to Maria Shriver, was a rupture that was genuinely damaging both to his marriage and to the public persona he had built. He has addressed it in his memoir with a degree of honesty that some found insufficient and others found more than they expected from someone in his position. Maria Shriver filed for divorce. The marriage ended. The story added a layer of human failure to a narrative that had been almost implausibly triumphant until that point. What remains is still staggering in scope. From a village in Austria to the highest elected office in the most powerful state in America, through bodybuilding and Hollywood and business and politics, built entirely on the back of a vision he articulated at 15 and never let go of. He didn't speak the language. He didn't know anyone. He had no money, no connections, no template to follow. He made one anyway. 10 names, 10 stories. And when you lay them all out like this, something starts to emerge that isn't about talent exactly, or not only about talent. Cardi B and Eminem and Tyler Perry and Nicki Minaj all had extraordinary gifts, but so do thousands of people who never make it out of the circumstances they were born into. What separates these 10 is something harder to name and harder to teach. It might be stubbornness. It might be a refusal to accept the verdict of anyone who says no, or a fundamental inability to imagine a version of themselves that doesn't get to what they're aiming for. Oprah was too emotional. Jay-Z was too street. Arnold's name was too long, and his accent was too thick, and his body was too extreme. Every single one of them was told, by people with industry expertise and genuine authority, that they didn't fit. None of them believed it. And that's probably the most unsettling thing about this list. Not the wealth, not the fame, not the records and the studios and the billion-dollar brands. It's the fact that in almost every case, the official gatekeepers were wrong. The thing they wanted to change was the thing that turned out to matter most, the rawness that Cardi refused to sand down, the blackness that Jay-Z refused to dilute, the emotion that Oprah refused to suppress, the accent that Arnold refused to lose. The world told all of them to be smaller. They got bigger instead. So here's the question worth sitting with after this video ends. What is it that you've been told is a liability? What is the thing that someone in a position of authority has suggested, you should change or hide or minimize? And what if they're wrong? The people on this list didn't have an answer to that question. They just kept going until the question stopped mattering. And the results are the 10 stories you just heard. Leave a comment below with who you think belongs on this list and who shouldn't be here. Because the debate about what self-made actually means, who earns the label and who doesn't, is one that doesn't have a clean answer. And the most interesting conversations start right there.